On a crisp autumn afternoon, Officer David Chen sat in his patrol car, finishing up his daily reports when something caught his eye. A small figure, barely visible behind the maple trees lining Cedar Street, was moving in an odd pattern. At first, he thought it might be just another kid playing after school, but his years of police experience told him to pay closer attention. As he watched, he noticed the child was following someone, and not just anyone. It was his wife Anna, making her usual walk home from Pine Grove Elementary School, where she taught second grade. The little girl, who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, would duck behind trees, mailboxes, or parked cars whenever Anna looked around. She wore a purple backpack that seemed too big for her small frame, and her dark hair was tied in 2 neat braids. David's first instinct as both a police officer and a protective husband was to intervene immediately. But something about the girl's behavior made him pause. There was no malice in her movements, no sense of threat. Instead, she seemed almost protective, like a tiny guardian angel keeping watch. The next day, David decided to modify his patrol route. Usually, he'd be on the other side of town when Anna walked home, but he wanted to see if this was a one-time occurrence. Sure enough, there she was again, the same little girl, same purple backpack, same careful distance. She moved like a small shadow, always staying exactly half a block behind Anna. Over the next few days, David observed this curious ritual repeat itself. He noticed small details: how the girl would stop whenever Anna stopped, pretending to tie her shoelaces or look at flowers. How she carried a worn notebook that she sometimes wrote in while watching. How her clothes, though clean and neat, were clearly well worn and a bit too large, as if meant to be grown into. What touched David most was how the girl's face would light up whenever Anna did something as simple as helping an elderly neighbor with groceries or stopping to pet a neighborhood cat. It was as if she was studying every kind act, taking mental notes of each gentle interaction. One particular afternoon, when the autumn wind picked up and scattered leaves across the sidewalk, David saw Anna drop her colorful scarf. Before she could notice, the little girl rushed forward, picked it up, and for a moment seemed about to return it. But then she hesitated, clutching the scarf with tiny fingers before carefully placing it on a nearby bench where Anna would surely see it on her way back. David found himself moved by this small gesture. Here was this child, clearly drawn to his wife for some reason, showing such care and consideration even while maintaining her distance. As a police officer, he'd seen plenty of concerning situations involving kids, but this felt different. This wasn't about trouble or mischief. There was something deeper going on. At home that evening, as he sat at their kitchen table watching Anna grade papers, David considered telling her about her young follower. But something held him back. His police instincts, usually pushing him to investigate and resolve situations quickly, were telling him to wait, to observe, to understand more before taking action. Looking at his wife's gentle smile as she wrote encouraging notes on her students' assignments, David couldn't help but wonder what it was about Anna that had drawn this mysterious little girl into their lives. He decided that before bringing it up with Anna or taking any official action, he needed to learn more about this child who had appointed herself as his wife's secret guardian. The autumn sun was setting earlier now, casting long shadows through their kitchen window, and David made a quiet promise to himself. He would solve this mystery, not just as a police officer, but as someone who sensed there was a story here that needed to be told. A story that might change not only this little girl's life, but their own as well. Over the next few weeks, David began noticing little details that made this puzzle even more intriguing. The girl had a routine, almost as precise as a clock. She would appear 3 houses down from the school, always carrying that purple backpack, and always wearing her hair in those neat braids that someone clearly took time to make each morning. What caught his attention most was how she handled rainy days. On one particularly wet Thursday, she showed up with a small umbrella, but instead of using it herself, she kept it half raised, ready to rush forward if Anna got caught in a sudden downpour. The child was soaking wet by the end of her secret mission, but she never seemed to mind. David started taking notes in his small police notepad, something he usually reserved for work. 4:15 p.m. Purple backpack. Blue sweater today. Stopped at Mr. Wilson's flower shop window while Anna helped an old lady cross the street. These little observations painted a picture of a child who wasn't just following, she was learning. One day, he decided to park his patrol car on Oak Street, where the girl usually turned off after her daily following routine. He watched as she walked into the older part of town, where small houses sat close together, their paint slightly faded, but their tiny gardens well tended. She stopped at a yellow house with white trim and a small vegetable garden in the front. Through careful, friendly conversations with local shop owners, David learned more pieces of the puzzle. The owner of the corner grocery store mentioned that an older woman would come in late at night after her cleaning job, sometimes buying just enough food for 2 people. Sweet lady, he said, always has exact change and never complains about anything. The flower shop owner, Mr. Wilson, shared that he often saw the little girl standing outside his shop early in the morning, looking at the fresh flowers before school. Sometimes she would pick up fallen petals and carefully put them in her notebook. Reminds me of someone who's collecting precious things, he said, arranging his daisies. David also noticed how the girl would sometimes stop at the public library after her following routine. Through the window, he could see her sitting at a small table, doing homework or reading books that seemed too advanced for her age. The librarian mentioned that she was always polite but very quiet, and would often read books about teaching and educators. One afternoon, something different happened. Anna had stopped to help a cat stuck in a bush, and the girl moved closer than ever before to watch. David held his breath, wondering if this would be the day she finally approached. But then a car honked nearby, making the girl jump and quickly hide behind a tree. The look on her face wasn't fear exactly. It was more like she was protecting a precious secret. That evening, as David sat in their cozy living room watching Anna sort through her teaching materials, he noticed something interesting. Among Anna's student drawings was a picture that caught his eye. A small figure with braids standing near a bigger figure surrounded by hearts. The signature was smudged, but he could make out the date from the previous school year. He picked up the drawing, studying it carefully. Anna looked up and smiled softly. That's from last year's class. Some of these kids really touch your heart, you know. There was something in her voice, a gentle warmth that made David wonder if there was more to this story than even he had discovered. David found himself staying up late that night, looking through old community newsletters and school announcements from the past year. The more he learned, the more he realized that this wasn't just about a little girl following his wife. This was about connection, about seeking something that maybe all of us need, a kind presence in our lives. As he closed his laptop, the clock showing well past midnight, David looked out their kitchen window toward the older part of town. Somewhere out there, in a yellow house with white trim, was a little girl with a purple backpack who had somehow become part of their story. And he was beginning to understand that solving this mystery might lead to something more meaningful than he'd ever expected. The next morning, David decided to dig deeper, but in the gentlest way possible. He started his day early, parking his patrol car near the elementary school. As he sipped his coffee, he watched parents and kids arriving for the school day. Right on schedule, he spotted the little girl walking alone, her purple backpack bouncing slightly with each step. This time, though, he noticed something different. She was carrying a small paper bag, carefully holding it as if it contained something precious. She stopped at the school entrance, took something out of the bag. It looked like a handmade card, and very carefully slipped it into the teacher's mailbox just inside the door. David made a mental note to ask Anna if she'd received anything special that day. During his lunch break, David visited the school office. Being a police officer had its advantages. People trusted him, and they were usually happy to help. The front desk secretary, a kind-hearted woman who'd worked there for 20 years, was more than willing to chat about their students. "Oh, you mean little Rose?" she said when David described the girl. "Such a quiet child, but her eyes tell stories. She lives with her grandmother, sweetest lady you'll ever meet. Works herself to the bone to give that child everything she can." The secretary shared that Rose's grandmother worked 3 jobs: morning shifts at the local diner, afternoon cleaning at offices, and weekend work at the grocery store. "That woman hasn't taken a day off in 2 years," she said, shaking her head with admiration. "And little Rose, she's so mature for her age. Never complains, always has her homework done." David learned that Rose had been in Anna's class the previous year. She'd been an exceptional student, not just in grades, but in how she cared for others. There was a story about how she'd spent her only birthday money buying pencils for a classmate who couldn't afford school supplies. She'd done it so quietly that no one knew until the other child's mother called the school in tears of gratitude. As he sat in his patrol car later that afternoon, David watched Rose following her usual route behind Anna. Now that he knew her name, her story, everything looked different. He noticed how she would sometimes touch the brick walls of buildings as she walked, almost like she was making sure the world was real. How she would straighten her worn but clean clothes, trying to look her best even when no one was watching. The piece that touched him most came from the school nurse. She mentioned that last winter, when Rose had a fever, her grandmother couldn't leave work to pick her up. Rose had sat in the nurse's office, declining to lie down because she didn't want to wrinkle her clothes. "I need to look nice," she'd said. "Teachers are important people." That evening, David found the card Rose had left that morning. Anna was reading it at their kitchen table, wiping tears from her eyes. It was a simple thank you note, handmade with careful child's writing, thanking her former teacher for being kind. There was no signature, but there was a small drawing of a purple backpack in the corner. "I get these sometimes," Anna said softly. "They just appear in my mailbox. I've never known who." Her voice trailed off as David sat down beside her. He realized that Rose wasn't just following Anna. She was learning how to be the kind of person she admired. Every time Anna helped someone, every time she showed kindness, Rose was taking mental notes. She was teaching herself how to be good in a world that hadn't always been good to her. As the sun set outside their kitchen window, David watched his wife carefully place the card in a special box where she kept meaningful notes from students. He thought about Rose and her grandmother, about quiet strength and silent gratitude. This wasn't just an investigation anymore. It was becoming a story about how people can touch each other's lives without even knowing it. And somehow, David knew that what he'd learned today was just the beginning of a much bigger story, one that would change not just Rose's life, but all of theirs. As David dug deeper into Rose's story at school, he discovered a connection that made his heart ache with understanding. Looking through old class records, he found something remarkable. During the previous year, when Rose was in Anna's class, there were quiet acts of kindness that his wife had never mentioned to anyone. The cafeteria records showed that anonymous lunch payments had been made whenever Rose's account ran low. There were new notebooks, pencils, and even a winter coat that had mysteriously appeared on Rose's desk when the weather turned cold. All of these things had come at times when Rose's grandmother was between paychecks, struggling to make ends meet. David remembered how Anna would sometimes stop at the store on her way home from school, buying extra supplies that she said were for the classroom. Now he understood. She had been quietly helping Rose all along, doing it in a way that protected the little girl's dignity and her grandmother's pride. One afternoon, while reviewing the school's attendance records, David noticed something that made him pause. On days when Rose had been marked late for school, there were notes about her grandmother's car breaking down. But somehow, on those very days, Anna had always arrived at school especially early, as if she knew she might be needed. The school crossing guard filled in another piece of the puzzle. "Oh yes," she said, adjusting her bright orange vest. Your wife would often wait by the crosswalk those mornings. When she'd see Rose walking alone, she'd casually start walking too, like it was just a coincidence they were going the same way. The crossing guard smiled. Some people have a way of helping without making it feel like help. In the teacher's break room, David found more clues. Another teacher mentioned how Anna would pack extra snacks in her lunch bag, and somehow they would end up with hungry students during recess. She never made a show of it, the teacher said. The kids just knew they could come to her if they needed something. The school librarian shared a particularly touching story. She had noticed that Rose would often check out books about teaching and education. One day, she found a carefully written list that had fallen from one of the returned books. It was titled How to Be Like Mrs. Chen, and included things like smile at everyone and help without being asked. David sat in his car that afternoon, watching Rose follow her usual path behind Anna. He noticed how the little girl would sometimes mimic his wife's walking pattern, how she would stop to pick up litter just as Anna did, how she would wave at the same neighbors Anna greeted. It wasn't just following anymore. It was learning, growing, becoming. That evening, as Anna graded papers at their kitchen table, David watched her more carefully than usual. She had this habit of writing long, encouraging notes on students' work, staying up late to make sure each child got the attention they deserved. He wondered how many other quiet acts of kindness she had performed that he had never noticed. He thought about mentioning Rose to her, about sharing what he had discovered. But as he watched his wife thoughtfully writing another encouraging note on a student's paper, he realized something important. Sometimes, the most beautiful acts of kindness are the ones that remain unspoken, living in the quiet spaces between people's hearts. Looking at an old class photo on their refrigerator, David finally spotted Rose in the back row, her smile shy, but her eyes bright with hope. Next to her stood Anna, one hand gently resting on Rose's shoulder. The connection was there all along, visible yet invisible, like so many important things in life. As night fell outside their cozy kitchen, David understood that this wasn't just about a little girl following his wife home. It was about how love and kindness can flow between people in silent, powerful ways. It was about how some teachers never stop teaching, and some students never stop learning, even after the school bell rings. And somewhere out there, a little girl with a purple backpack was probably doing her homework, perhaps dreaming of becoming just like the teacher who had touched her life in ways that were both seen and unseen. The truth about Rose's daily life began to unfold in ways that touched David's heart deeply. Through careful conversations with neighbors and community members, he learned that Rose's grandmother worked from dawn until dusk, leaving for her first job while most people were still asleep and returning home long after the streetlights came on. One morning, David drove past the local diner where Rose's grandmother worked her first shift. Through the window, he could see her serving customers with a warm smile, despite the obvious exhaustion in her eyes. Her uniform was spotlessly clean, pressed with the same care he'd noticed in Rose's clothes. Now he understood where the little girl had learned such dignity in difficult circumstances. The owner of the corner store shared a story that made David's throat tight with emotion. "That little girl comes in here sometimes with a handful of coins," he said, arranging cans on a shelf. "Always counts them carefully before buying anything. Last week, she spent everything she had on a small bunch of flowers. When I asked who they were for, she just smiled and said, 'Someone special who doesn't know they're special.'" Later that day, David noticed those same flowers anonymously placed on Anna's desk at school. During his patrol, David would sometimes see Rose in the afternoon, sitting on the front steps of their small yellow house, doing her homework. She had created a makeshift desk from an old crate, and she would study there until the shadows grew long. Sometimes she would look up at passing cars, perhaps hoping to see her grandmother returning from one of her many jobs. The neighbor living next door to Rose and her grandmother revealed another layer of their story. "That child never complains, not once," she said, watering her plants. "Sometimes I hear her talking to her grandmother's photo before bed, telling her about her day, promising to make her proud. Her grandmother misses so much, working all those jobs, but that little girl understands. She understands more than any child should have to. One particularly revealing moment came when David was called to the grocery store where Rose's grandmother worked her weekend shifts. A customer had fallen, and while writing up his report, he overheard two employees talking. They mentioned how Rose's grandmother would save her employee discount to buy school supplies, stretching every dollar as far as it would go. She would work extra hours during school supply season, just to make sure Rose had everything she needed. The school janitor, who stayed late every day, shared that he often saw Rose walking home alone in the early evening darkness. "But she's never really alone," he said, leaning on his mop. "She talks to herself sometimes, practicing how to greet people kindly, just like your wife does. She'll stop and say, 'Good evening' to nobody, then do it again until it sounds just right." David discovered that Rose spent many afternoons in the public library, not just reading, but watching the librarians help people. She would take notes in her worn notebook, writing down how they spoke to children, how they solved problems, how they made everyone feel welcome. It was as if she was collecting kindness, storing it up like precious treasure. The most touching discovery came from the school cafeteria worker. She mentioned that sometimes, when other kids didn't finish their lunch, Rose would carefully wrap up the leftover food. The worker once overheard her explaining to a curious classmate, "My grandma works so hard, she sometimes forgets to eat. I want to make sure she has something nice when she gets home." That evening, as David watched Anna preparing for the next school day, he thought about how Rose and her grandmother were just like many others in their community, working hard, staying proud, finding ways to give even when they had little to give. The little girl who followed his wife wasn't running from something. She was running toward something: hope, kindness, a future she was determined to build. As the kitchen light cast a warm glow through their window, David realized that some of life's most important stories happen in these quiet moments, in the spaces between survival and dreams, where people like Rose and her grandmother show us what true strength really means. That evening, as David sat at their kitchen table, he finally decided to tell Anna about Rose. His wife was sorting through her teaching supplies, carefully putting aside extra notebooks and pencils as she always did. He took a deep breath and gently placed the latest anonymous thank you note in front of her. "I know who's been leaving these," he said softly. Anna's hands stopped moving, and she looked up at him with questioning eyes. As David began sharing what he discovered, tears started rolling down Anna's cheeks. But they weren't tears of surprise. They were tears of recognition. "I've known all along," she whispered, pulling out a small box from her teaching cabinet. Inside were dozens of little notes, drawings, and even pressed flowers, all from Rose. "I've kept every single one." Her voice trembled as she lifted out a carefully folded paper crane. "She leaves them where she thinks I won't know they're from her, but I always do." Anna shared her own side of the story, how during the previous school year, she had noticed Rose's situation. The little girl never complained, even when her pencils were down to stubs or when her notebook was completely full. She would just write smaller, make every space count, Anna explained, wiping her eyes. She told David about the quiet ways she tried to help. Leaving supplies on Rose's desk before class started, making sure there was always an extra sandwich in her lunch that she couldn't finish, coordinating with the school office to cover field trip fees as an anonymous donor. "I had to be careful," she said. "Rose and her grandmother have so much pride. I never wanted them to feel like charity cases." David learned that Anna had been doing even more than he discovered. She'd been arriving at school early on cold mornings, knowing Rose would be walking alone. She'd deliberately take longer routes home, giving Rose more time to follow safely in the daylight. She kept granola bars in her coat pockets, casually dropping them near where Rose would find them. The following started last spring. Anna continued, sorting through the box of memories. "I noticed her one day, but pretended not to. I could see she needed something. Not food or supplies, but something else. Something harder to give. She pulled out a crumpled drawing of a teacher helping a student. She needed hope. As they talked late into the evening, David and Anna shared their separate pieces of Rose's story, creating a full picture that left them both emotional. Anna revealed how she'd been keeping track of Rose's grandmother's work schedule through casual conversations with other teachers, making sure someone was always keeping an eye on Rose during the tough evening hours. "You know what breaks my heart the most?" Anna said, holding up one of Rose's notes. "She writes these thank you notes for things I haven't even done. It's like she's thanking me for simply existing, for being someone she can look up to. How do you live up to that kind of faith?" David watched as his wife carefully arranged all the notes back in their box. He understood now why she spent so many extra hours at school, why she always insisted on buying extra supplies, why she sometimes seemed lost in thought during their evening meals. "Sometimes," Anna said quietly, "when I see her hiding behind trees or mailboxes, I want so badly to turn around and hug her. But I know that's not what she needs right now. She needs to believe she's invisible, that she's learning these lessons on her own. Sometimes love means letting someone follow you from a distance." As the night grew deeper, David and Anna sat in their kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a little girl's admiration and a teacher's quiet compassion. Outside, the streets were dark and silent, but somewhere in a small yellow house, a child was probably dreaming of becoming someone who could change lives, just like her favorite teacher. They realized that sometimes the biggest acts of love are the ones we never talk about, the silent gifts we give without expecting recognition. And in their quiet kitchen, surrounded by small paper treasures, they understood that they were part of something much bigger than themselves. The turning point came on a cold, rainy Tuesday afternoon. David was on his usual patrol when the call came through his radio. There had been an accident at the cleaning company where Rose's grandmother worked. His heart dropped as he recognized the address, and he immediately turned his patrol car around. At the scene, he found Rose's grandmother had slipped on a freshly mopped floor. She had been rushing between jobs, trying to make up for lost time after staying late at her morning shift. The paramedics were already there, carefully helping her onto a stretcher. Despite her protests that she was fine, the pain in her eyes told a different story. "I have to get to my other job," she kept saying, trying to sit up. "Rose will be home soon. I need to." Her voice trailed off as the pain became too much. The doctors later confirmed she had broken her hip, an injury that would take months to heal properly. David's first thought was of Rose, who would be following Anna home right about now, unaware that her world was about to change. He made a call to the school, but Rose had already left. The rain was coming down harder now, and somewhere out there, a little girl with a purple backpack was walking through it. The social worker arrived at the hospital looking tired and overwhelmed. "We'll have to place her in temporary foster care," she said, flipping through her files. With no other family members available, David felt his heart tighten. He knew how the system worked, knew how children could get lost in it, even temporarily. He found himself reaching for his phone, dialing Anna's number with shaking fingers. When she answered, he didn't need to explain much. "I'm already looking for her," Anna said, understanding immediately. "Don't worry, I know all her hiding spots." Anna found Rose in the public library, sitting in her usual corner, surrounded by books about teaching. She had no idea anything was wrong, thought it was just another ordinary day of secretly learning how to be more like her favorite teacher. The sight of Anna actually approaching her made Rose freeze, her eyes wide with surprise and uncertainty. The conversation that followed was one of the gentlest moments in both their lives. Anna sat down next to Rose, not too close, respecting the distance the child had maintained for so long. "Your grandmother is going to be okay," she began softly, "but she needs some help right now. And I think maybe you do too." Rose's reaction wasn't what anyone might have expected. She didn't cry or show fear. Instead, She reached into her worn backpack and pulled out her notebook. "I've been practicing," she said quietly, opening to a page filled with neat handwriting. "I've been learning how to be strong like her, like you." Back at the hospital, David was talking with Rose's grandmother, who was fighting against the pain medication to stay awake. "Rose," she kept saying, "she needs somewhere safe." David listened as she spoke about their life together, about all the things she had tried to provide, about her fears of them being separated. That's when David made a decision that would change all their lives. He called Anna again, and without needing to say much, they both knew what had to be done. Years of wanting children, but being unable to have their own, had prepared them for this moment in ways they hadn't understood until now. The social worker looked relieved when David and Anna offered to be Rose's temporary guardians. They were already approved foster parents, having completed the certification process years ago, though they had never taken in a child. It felt like all the pieces were falling into place, as if everything in their lives had been leading to this moment. As the rain continued to fall outside the hospital windows, Rose sat between Anna and David, her small hand holding her grandmother's. For the first time, she didn't have to hide her admiration for her teacher. For the first time, she didn't have to follow from a distance. Sometimes, David thought, the hardest storms bring the most beautiful rainbows. The decision to become Rose's temporary guardians wasn't just a matter of paperwork and signatures. For David and Anna, it meant transforming their quiet home into a space where a child could feel safe and loved. They spent the evening after leaving the hospital preparing the spare room, which had been waiting empty for so long. Anna pulled out the box of children's books she'd been collecting over the years, arranging them on shelves that had gathered dust. David found himself at the store late at night, buying things he never thought he'd need: a nightlight, colorful bedding, and a small desk where Rose could do her homework without using an old crate. Rose arrived the next day with her purple backpack and a small suitcase containing everything she owned. She stood in the doorway of her new room, her eyes wide with wonder. "Is this really where I'll stay?" she whispered, touching the soft blanket on the bed as if it might disappear. The room had been painted a gentle shade of yellow, just like her grandmother's house. The first few days were filled with quiet adjustments. Rose would wake up early, make her bed with military precision, and get ready for school without making a sound. She was trying so hard to be perfect, to be no trouble at all, that it made David and Anna's hearts ache. They found notes from her in the morning. "Thank you for the breakfast," or "I cleaned my plate," each one written in her careful handwriting. One evening, as Anna was helping Rose with homework at the kitchen table, they heard a small laugh, the first they'd heard from her. She had made a silly mistake in her math problem, and instead of being afraid of being wrong, she found it funny. The sound of her laughter filled the kitchen like sunshine after rain. David took to driving by the hospital during his patrol shifts, checking on Rose's grandmother. She was making progress, but recovery would take time. Each visit, she would ask about Rose, and David would share little stories. How Rose was teaching their old cat to sit, how she had started humming while doing her homework, how she was finally beginning to relax around them. The real breakthrough came during a thunderstorm. Instead of hiding in her room, Rose appeared in the living room doorway, clutching her worn notebook. Could I sit with you?" she asked softly. They spent the evening together, Anna teaching Rose how to make paper boats, David telling funny stories from his police work, the thunder outside forgotten. At school, things began to change too. Rose no longer needed to follow Anna home. She walked beside her now, helping to carry books and supplies. Other teachers noticed the change in her. She was still quiet, still thoughtful, but there was a new confidence in her step. She started raising her hand in class, sharing the knowledge she'd gathered during all those hours of careful observation. One Saturday morning, they visited Rose's grandmother at the hospital. She was sitting up in bed, looking stronger. Rose proudly showed her the A+ she'd received on a science project, and for a moment, all the adults in the room had to wipe their eyes. "You're doing so well," her grandmother said, holding Rose's hand. "You're becoming exactly who you're meant to be." That evening, as they drove home from the hospital, Rose asked if they could stop at the library. She returned her books about teaching and checked out one about police work instead. "I'd want to learn about what David does too," she explained, hugging the book to her chest. It was the first time she'd called him by his name instead of Sir. Later that night, Anna found Rose's notebook left open on her desk. The old list titled How to Be Like Mrs. Chen had been expanded. Below it was a new list, Things I Learn at My New Home. The first item read, It's okay to be seen. The last item simply said, Love doesn't have to be quiet. As David and Anna stood in the doorway of Rose's room, watching her sleep peacefully surrounded by her books and drawings, they realized that sometimes the best families are the ones that find each other in unexpected ways. Sometimes the biggest changes in life come softly, on quiet feet, following behind us until we turn around and welcome them home. 3 months later, on a bright spring morning, Rose's grandmother was finally ready to come home. Her recovery had been long but successful, and the doctors were pleased with her progress. The small yellow house had been waiting patiently for her return, its front garden now blooming with flowers that Rose had planted during weekend visits. But something had changed during those months, something beautiful and unexpected. What had started as a temporary arrangement had grown roots deeper than anyone could have imagined. Rose's grandmother, watching how her granddaughter had blossomed in David and Anna's care, made a decision that came from pure love. Rose needs stability, she said during a heart-to-heart conversation with David and Anna. She needs a family that can be there for homework and bedtime stories. She needs what you've given her. Her eyes filled with tears as she continued, and I need to know she's safe while I heal and get back on my feet. Together, they worked out an arrangement that felt right for everyone. Rose would continue living with David and Anna, but she would spend every weekend at the yellow house with her grandmother. It wasn't about replacing family. It was about extending it, creating a web of love and support that would catch Rose no matter which way she fell. The day they made it official was filled with small, precious moments. Rose's grandmother moved into a smaller apartment closer to her main job, reducing her workload to focus on her health. The yellow house was sold, but not before Rose carefully dug up some of the flowers from the garden to replant at her new home. At school, the change was remarkable. Rose no longer needed to hide her connection to Anna. She became known for helping new students feel welcome, showing them around with the same kindness she had once watched from afar. Her notebook was still filled with observations, but now they were about how to make others feel seen and valued. David found himself learning too. His patrol car would often slow down near playgrounds now, watching children with a new understanding. He started a program at the police station for kids who needed a safe place to do homework after school. Sometimes, he'd catch Rose showing other children her favorite spots in the building, explaining her father's work with obvious pride. Anna kept the box of Rose's old thank you notes, but it was joined by new mementos, report cards, art projects, and photographs of their growing family. The latest addition was a family portrait, drawn by Rose, showing all 4 of them together, David, Anna, Rose, and her grandmother, surrounded by flowers from both gardens. One evening, as they all sat around the dinner table, a regular occurrence now, Rose's grandmother shared stories about Rose as a baby. There was no sadness in the telling, only joy in having more people to share these precious memories with. Rose sat between her 2 families, belonging fully to both, no longer needing to follow anyone from a distance. The purple backpack still hung by the door, but it was joined by sports equipment, art supplies, and all the normal trappings of a happy childhood. Rose still wrote in her notebook, but the entries were different now. Today I learned that family can grow like flowers. One page read, and love multiplies when you share it. In the end, what had started with a little girl secretly following a kind teacher had grown into something none of them could have predicted. It had become a story about how families aren't always made the way we expect them to be. Sometimes they're formed in the quiet moments between heartbeats, in the spaces between shadows and light, in the love that grows when we're brave enough to let people in. As the sun set on another ordinary day in their extraordinary family, Rose sat on the porch steps between her two homes. She didn't need to hide anymore, didn't need to practice being seen. She did become exactly who she was meant to be, a child who knew she was loved, surrounded by people who had chosen each other, creating a family that was different but somehow perfect in its own way. And somewhere, in a desk drawer, a worn notebook held the first words she had ever written about her teacher. "When I grow up, I want to help people feel less alone." Without knowing it, she had already accomplished that goal, bringing together four souls who might have remained apart, creating a family that proved love knows no boundaries, and showing that sometimes the best things in life start with a simple act of following your heart.